to attend in person or virtually, as well as all our colleagues from ECLAC that are with us here today. The um, introduction of the document will be done by the um, temporary secretary, General Secretary of ECLAC, Mario Cimoli, and Daniel Wittelmann from the Statistics Department will be presenting the information. We also have some panelists from the economic group, Cecilia Vera, Ramon Pineda, Juan Pérez, Esteban Pérez. And after the presentation, we will give way to a round of Q&A for the journalists, and we would like to remind you that you can also send questions in writing via the chat in the Zoom platform or by email to conferenciaprensa@cepal.org. In order to kick off this launch, I would like to offer the floor to the Executive Secretary, Mario Cimoli. Good morning to all. Thank you, Vito. Today, we are presenting a document in a very important macroeconomic moment. It is a document led by whose work was led by Daniel Wittelmann, and it also had a joint effort by several offices. It is a collective work by ECLAC and very important at a very particular moment, a very complex moment that goes beyond anything that we can mention here today. And it's a moment where economic debate will take place throughout the region in all countries. So we wish to be paying attention to everything that is going on in the region and the world, because the global context affects the region directly. So without further ado, I would like to make a few comments at the end of the presentation. I would like to ask the director of the division, Daniel Tiedelman, to offer the presentation, and then we will be stressing a few aspects of the document. It has been announced as including several investments that are not in the macro context, the macroeconomic context. So there are novelties, there's new figures, there's figures on investment in the region that are quite novel, as I said. So I would like to offer the floor to Daniel to offer the presentation and then a few conclusions. And finally, we will conclude with a Q&A session. Daniel, you have the floor. Thank you, Mario. Well, as Mario Cimoli said, it's a document that reflects a global situation, very complex one, characterized by strong uncertainty, both economic as well as geopolitical, that are determining the trajectory and economic variables within and outside the region. And they try to discuss the impacts that we are seeing from the region, the challenges of policies in all our countries with a series of internal and external restrictions that Mario mentioned are affecting the world's economy. So this report shows us three elements that I believe are important and that we will discuss throughout the presentation. One is that the global economy, after the subprime crisis and then on the pandemic and the Ukrainian war, shows us a scenario of low growth and accelerating inflation, which has led to this lower GDP growth and world trade. There's been a significant drop of world trade and appreciation of the dollar, together with tightening of global financial conditions, which negatively affects the countries of the region. So the world today is in a less than favorable condition for the region, we're going to look at this more in detail. In the context of Latin America, what we're interested in stressing is that the region finds itself in the midst of a very complex economic restriction. It is following a low growth trajectory, and we saw this before the pandemic. And this year, we are already seeing a trend where this low growth path will persist in the coming years. And it's being accompanied by other inflationary aspects that are further making the economy complex. And there is a growth projection for this year. Should this lower growth trend continue, that makes it difficult to come out of this dynamic of inequality, of poverty reduction, and investment. So that is one of the main challenges for economic policies. And as Mario mentioned, there is a structural element that also affects the current situation. It is that the dynamics of investment in the last 3 decades, last 30 to 40 years, has become a structural constraint to sustainable development. And this is a huge challenge for the countries in the region. It is not only about how to modify the economic cycle, but how to do it in the medium to long term, and of course, with sustainable and inclusive growth. Very briefly, as we've mentioned earlier, the global economy has been affected by the Ukrainian war. And as is the case of any pre-war situation, the world expected to grow 3.4 this year, and after the war, we're at 3.1. The US expected to grow around 4%, and it's around 1.7. That is the red bar on the right-hand side. The same for the Eurozone and the UK, finally China. And we see today debate around the Chinese economy, which is a little more complex, which is what we're seeing in the construction sector. It's around 3.4% of the GDP. There is a real estate bubble, and there's many signs that are showing that, plus the COVID policies that they have, are making growth in China lower than what we would have expected.
And that does make things much more complicated. It makes things difficult for the region, given that our primary partners, the United States and China and the Eurozone, thirdly, are going to have less growth and less lower demand than usual. And therefore, this will therefore have a tremendous impact on our region, again, particularly in coming years through lower demand in in the regional economy as well as the global economy, lower growth in GDP, as I've noted. In any case, we expect worldwide growth in trade to grow at around 3%, a little bit higher than last year, but nonetheless, certainly there are concerns in the worldwide economy, both a real economy as well as the broader theoretical economy. The other aspect that is also particularly important is the area of commodities. So, foodstuffs, energy, fertilizers, which is what we can see on the right. We will see these prices of hydrocarbons, particularly foodstuff and so forth. Again, this is a very important factor that helps to explain both global or worldwide inflation as well as regional inflation. And we believe that that is a key aspect. This uptake has also led to strong changes in the prices of commodities and has led to a fall on average around 7%. And this is in terms of these commodities, it's heterogeneous across the regions, sub-regions of exporters and importers. Obviously, the primary distinction there are the exporters of hydrocarbons. But in any case, we're seeing a very strong downturn in the countries of the Caribbean, around 17%, and that rolls over into Central America as well. We can see that the impact of these commodity changes is particularly important, not only at the macroeconomic level through inflation, but also in terms of an upsurge in social instability and a greater likelihood of worldwide issues and lack of stability. We're also seeing the changes in the United States and in the EU, with emerging countries an average of 7.1% in terms of the uptick in worldwide inflation, again, as reported by central banks in developed countries. This shows more restrictive monetary policies, contractions that have led to two things. A reduction in global liquidity, as we can see on the chart on the left-hand side for the United States, in yellow for 2022, as well as for the Eurozone. We can also see the US, UK, Japan, the global liquidity is also reduced in terms of dynamism of financial markets. An important point that I'd like to highlight here is that the central banks in the developed countries, while at the beginning and giving the difficulties and the challenges of evaluating inflationary pressures, have been relatively careful in terms of the pressures applied on the interest rate. And we do see that the inflationary pressure is being maintained and continues to rise given the acceleration and the greater persistence that we've seen in terms of inflation recently. Hand in hand with this chart, we can also see that the conditions has also worsened in terms of international flows when there are a lot of turbulence, a lot of uncertainty, what the economists call flight to quality. We can see that the interest rates tend to move again toward more stable markets such as the United States, which also helps to explain the appreciation of the dollar. In the case of Latin America, of course, this has not been the exception, as financial flows toward the region have tended to fall around 13%. And so we're seeing this impact on the region, as we can see in these charts. This is also reflected in the sovereign risk of many of the countries. We can see this in the case, particularly of Honduras, Ecuador, Argentina, and El Salvador. But for many countries in the region, we've also seen that there have been and that investment grade or the has been not been maintained, or that the sovereign risk of these countries has risen as a result of these issues. Now, I did want to note that prior to the pandemic, the region was growing, although not very strongly. If we look at the average in 2014, 2019, the average was zero point 0.6. In 2019, the year before the pandemic, the region did continue to grow. However, we get the pandemic, the worst contraction in the last 100 years, and then we see the resurgence, which has to do with the comparison in terms of 2020, and this huge shock, which then created this growth. So if we look at the poor growth rate, and this is not just a question of what is we're seeing in terms of the social issues and so forth. We're seeing these changes again in growth. We're seeing this bouncing back a bit last year for very specific reasons. And on this graphic, we can also see in the first semester of this year, and we can see those changes as well. We can also see how in the fourth and fifth trimesters of last year, we have a comparison trimester to trimester. There are, again, these changes as a result of greater activity But this year, we're beginning to see a very strong downturn for the region. This reduction, we believe, will continue throughout the rest of the year and will probably be maintained next year as well. Therefore, we're seeing this very important message that we are moving into a period of low growth following the uptick in 2021. And what we're seeing the first quarter and first and second quarter of this year and into next year, we're seeing that unfortunately there has been, we will continue to see this weak growth following the stagnation prior to 2020. And we can also see, if we look at the aggregate demand, the variable that hits the hardest here is investment. You can see the gray line here, which is the one that drops the most as of 2021, and we can see this slowdown in the third and fourth quarters of last year and also the first quarter of this year. And that investment is just about zero. And so this is a very unfortunate feature for this region, which is that it is the region that is growing the least in terms of overall or aggregate investment. And that is what we were also seeing to a certain extent in the previous chart in terms of economic activity rather. In this context, therefore, of the downturn in investment and in growth, obviously the value of goods, exports, imports, and remittances are slowing as compared to last year. We're around 22% in the case of exports and 23% of imports, as we can see, as compared to last year. Now, a positive concept for the region for developed countries and some countries in South America is the resilience that we've seen in remittances in 2021 and 2020 and in 2022 so far to date. In general, remittances have grown a little bit more coming into the region. Those are extremely important, primarily in the area of consumption rather than investment. One would like to see that change, but nonetheless, it is extremely important in terms of the aggregate demand for goods. An element associated with this topic, particularly in food, energy, has to do with the global inflation and the shock to supply chain as a result of the pandemic and subsequent political and worldwide events. Nonetheless, what we can see is that the rising prices, particularly for energy, are phenomenal. The growth rate in costs of energy is practically 15.2% through May of this year. Food is around 12%. And the underlying inflation, when you remove energy and foodstuffs, is approximately 7.1. And that has a tremendous impact. Also, again, we can see this impact of the increase in energy prices in foodstuffs. We can see the red line on the left-hand side of the chart. We can see the average inflation 2019 was 4.1%. Today, we're talking more around 8.4% for this year. In other words, we practically doubled that inflation as compared to 2019 across the region. And again, looking at energy and food, there is a strong correlation and a strong or large amount of this inflation is due to the fact that many of these foodstuffs are also imported. And so they're importing either food or hydrocarbons, or in some cases, both. And to the extent that they could change that mix, then we could also see a significant change in the rising inflation. And I think this is extremely important to highlight because it has to do more with the macro and not just economic policies of individual countries. As I was saying, these rising food prices and energy prices has also led to a both a depreciation in currencies as well as greater volatility. In case of Brazil, it's about been a devaluation of around 35% between second semester, excuse me, the second quarter of 2019, the second or the first half of 2022. The same thing has happened in Uruguay and Chile. And we've seen in all cases there's been a sharp devaluation in their currency. And this is something that we'll come back to in a little while. Now, how have the central banks reacted? They've reacted almost to a greater or lesser extent, but they have all raised their interest rates via monetary policy. And we've also seen an effort to increase liquidity. All countries have also seen rising inflation, and in all countries except Honduras, the interest rates have tended to rise, not with the same intensity. Brazil, the last column in the chart, we can see that that rate rose 11.25%, Chile 9.25, Colombia is 7.25, Costa Rica 4.75, and we can see that there are countries that have had a greater intensity in terms of their monetary policy impact on that. Again, we can see Brazil inflation is around 12, Chile 12.5 through June up to 13.5, according to the most recent calculations, Colombia 9.7, and so on and so forth. The central banks are reacting, raising the rate in terms of monetary policy, but a lower intensity. And in the last line, we can see the comparison with the United States and the EU. While there have been rises there as well, they've been more moderate than we've seen in the region. What is happening on the fiscal front? We can see that the important aspect here is declines in deficits have continued as debt levels remain high. And so we can see this is around 24.6 through 2024. The economy will begin to recover. The pandemic, of course, from the economic perspective, has hit hard, and we're looking at a social expenditure of around 21.9% for this year. The in this increase in reduction in expenditures we've seen as a result of the pandemic, and fiscal revenues also have changed. We can see that this trajectory as again, the declines in deficits have continued. We can see in this both globally and generally, and we're hoping this year to have a primary deficit around 0.9% or around 1%. But what I wanted to highlight here is the tracking, the tendency, the trend, because compared to last year, because as we will see, there are a lot of these incentives, the transfers that are being, these incentives that are being removed that started up during the pandemic. If we look at the other side of the coin, if we look at the area of debt, we can also see that there's been a slight reduction in public debt so far this year. But in any case, over 50%, that's a rate that we hadn't seen since the early 2000s. And so public debt continues to be, as we've noted, a very important topic. As I was saying, the reduction in fiscal expenditures, we can see different components on screen. The biggest downturn is in current accounts and current government spending. We can see this in light blue. there has been in turn that we can see the payment in interest rates as well as capital transfers. Again, this can be explained because the region is going back to pre-pandemic transfer levels. The red line shows around 7.8% today. We're seeing a forecast after a major change up to around 10.2 in GDP points in 2020 to help offset the impacts of the pandemic, which has been very important.
On the side of the Caribbean, we would like to alert the fact that there is a trend of a primary of 0.70.4, and the deficit will be maintained, will be affecting the payment of the debt. In the case of the Caribbean, it continues to increase the expenditure, and income has increased, but it has a precarious situation that we have talked about several times, has to do with the debt over GDP. Many countries expect 90%, such as Barbados and over 31%, Belize 104%. So the Caribbean continues to have a huge debt, and we have mentioned this in other instances. So in this context of strong external restrictions and domestic restrictions, we are projecting for that the region will grow 2.7%, which is less than half of what it grew last year. So it will continue with that low growth path that we have seen. And this year we're expecting, again, as I said, 2.7% growth, and we hope that we expect that the slowdown will continue in the future. Latin America, we see all the countries there with the corresponding bars. I'm not going to read them all, but Latin America and the Caribbean, 2.7, Latin America, 2.6, South America, 2.6, and then you have, well, Central America and Mexico, 2.5, Central America, 4.1, and the Caribbean, 4.7. The only country that will have a contraction in the Caribbean is well, we also have the 4.7 that excludes Guyana, but it reflects an acceleration of a series of countries in the Caribbean this year compared to what we saw last year. And Haiti is the only one that has a minus zero point 0.2. So again, as we said, Latin America and the Caribbean 2.7, Latin America and South America 2.6, Caribbean 4.7. Another element that we find important to stress is that this year, 16 countries in the region will not have recovered their GDP level. We can go back to the previous graph to see the growth trend in the region, and we see this heterogeneity here, and we see the countries that have recovered or not their GDP level. We have 16 countries out of 33 that have not recovered pre-pandemic GDP levels. So this shows you how different the situation is in the region. Some countries are in a more difficult situation than others. And this is something that we need to focus on because there's different national realities. The slowdown of the economic activity restricts the recovery of the labor market, especially for women. And here are a couple of figures that we see with the participation rate. Women are around 51.8 in 2019, and 2022, it's back to 51.1. But the unemployment rate, we believe, will grow a little compared to last year. In the case of women, it will be quite strong. Before the pandemic, women were at 9.5, and this year we expect to see 11.6. And men also 7.9 before the pandemic, and this year they will reach 9.4. So there's an interesting phenomenon here, which is that the labor markets are reacting with a delay. And in the region, we're seeing this as well. We see that we have slightly higher growth rate. There's a greater dynamism, but there are delays in the economic activity in the labor market, which is reflected here as well. And to conclude, allow me to mention a few things on the dynamics of investment. As I mentioned, this is the variable that would help economic growth, but it's a structural problem. And the structural problem has to do with the crises, debt crises of the 80s and from there on. On the left-hand side, we see that before the debt crisis between 1950 and 1980, investment showed investment rates of around 6.3, 5.6%, quite dynamic growth rates. But after the debt crisis, where there was a very negative point, 2.1, the region never recovered the same investment rates that we saw before this. We had periods of 3.6, 3.4, some periods of higher growth, but in the last 10 years, the investment rate has been around zero point 0.7 average, which shows a huge structural problem. It's not only the growth rate that has dropped, but also volatility. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is for private investment and public investment. We're not going to delve into the numbers, but this is what I was showing you earlier has to do with private and public investment. We see a lower growth rate and greater volatility as of the 90s. It's not only because of the political and economic situation. And the region is also showing the lowest investment rate compared to the world and more advanced economies. So the investment effort is lower in the region when you compare it to the rest of the world.
Y eso es tanto también para la evolución de la inversión privada, que en promedio ha sido
This is
5,1,
both for private investment, which has been around 7.1, and private, which has been 13.3 on average. With this, we will conclude the last few messages. In the case of public investment, it's not only a matter of rates, investment rates. We see that the public investment rate is the lowest. It's 2.8% for 2019. It's the lowest throughout the region in terms of advanced economies or compared to advanced economies, where we have 11.7. The region has 2.8, but the capital stock is also lower. And that makes things more complicated because when you have a capital stock that is lower, if you want to bridge gaps, you need to make a greater effort. So we have a large private investment, but when we put um, the public investment under the looking glass, then we see that it is much lower in terms of its stock, its capital stock, and that prevents the region from attracting private investment and others. In this complex context where there's low growth and high inflation, what are the challenges of macroeconomic policies? Well, on one hand, macroeconomic policies need to foster a more sustainable growth. They need to boost this growth and then mitigate inflationary pressures. We also need to generate quality employment. And these policies need to boost investment and reduce poverty and inequality. So it's a mix of things, it's a mix of objectives. And when it's growth, investment, employment, reducing poverty and inequality, macroeconomic policies need to be combined in order to generate coordination for fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies and to better use these tools. This is the main challenge that our countries have in terms of their macroeconomic policies. They need to take advantage of the set of tools, open this toolbox, and somehow make all this compatible and use and put an accent on these objectives. We need to take advantage of the tools at hand. In terms of monetary policies, the central banks have been using the interest rate. There's other instruments available that should be used to try to fight inflation, reducing the negative impact on growth. And these tools would be not only the monetary policies, but also others, exchange rates, instruments, forwards, spot markets, and the credit lines with BCs and IFIs, provisions restricting certain types of loans and others. So the message we wish to pass on here is that one single instrument is more difficult. If you only have one instrument, it's difficult to work with trade-off and investment and growth. And it is important, therefore, to diversify all these tools that the central banks have been using. And that is the challenge in the region. We need to open the toolbox and use what tools the central banks have at hand to supplement the interest rates and not put the fight against inflation only in one basket. That is the message consistent with the idea of structuring the objectives that we have. The fiscal policy needs to expand the space and sustainability of public expenditure and maintain a growing public expenditure. And this is done with tax reforms. Many countries are doing this, eliminating tax evasion and focusing on the taxes of. If you look at the differences between ours and the OECD countries, we see that personal taxes are high, but in our region, they are somewhat lower. We see that this is $325 billion of tax noncompliance represented, and is 6.1% of regional GDP. So we need to create the fiscal space, generate greater public expenditure to have a better, a more expansive fiscal policy in this context. And finally, challenges to increase investment. This has to do with a combination of the fact that we cannot allow public and private investment to be subordinated to anti-inflationary policies. So we believe that part of this coordination and opening tools is necessary, which we have for macro policies. It's essential to make growth more dynamic in view of the inflation. Fiscal incentives and adequate governance also help promote this coherence, efficiency, and effectiveness of public investment. National investment systems will have a significant role, and they will need to guarantee this coherence, as I mentioned, because it's not only about investing, there needs to be actual payment. And the region should have learned by now. Coordination, coordinating the issues that inhibit the adoption of new and better technology needs to be addressed in order to move forward. And the green transition, together with this greater demand for minerals, gives us a strategic view to impose challenges and adapt production methods and technologies to generate public incentives and private incentives. And finally, there's some comparative advantages that are significant. In fact, the new technologies, low carbon technologies, have strongly increased the demand for copper, iron, and lithium. And they're the commodities that are being exported. So the main challenge is to change how we produce and move towards this more green production system.
Climate change gives us a general perspective of the of investment, but it also gives us a broader view as a region and a guide that can help ensure development instruments and encourage us to strengthen the ones that are most effective, both in terms of accessing to finance for development and external financing, of course, which will be key to growth. And again, to conclude, let me share with you our key takeaways, our key messages. The region is following a path of low growth, similar to the one seen prior to the pandemic, and it is a situation of considerable external and internal restrictions that are likely to continue. The issues associated with making growth more dynamic, combating inflation, maintaining social policy, grappling with the costs across the region as a result of the pandemic, and increased dynamism and investment, of course, require a new mix of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and exchange rate policy, which poses a new challenge. And then this, of course, has an impact on macro policy overall, and that policy must boost sustainable growth, ensure price stability, create quality jobs, and reduce poverty and inequality. Therefore, bolstering investment is, of course, fundamental, along with greater coordination of macroeconomic policies. Macroeconomic efforts must go hand in hand with policy on industry and so forth. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel Titelman, the Director of Economic Growth here at ECLAC. And thank you for the presentation for this economic survey of Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at the challenges of investment for a recovery that is inclusive and for climate friendly. Thank you very much. I have three comments on what we've just heard. It is sad to say this, but I think I must. When we looked at this last year, some economists were able to say we were wrong. Sadly, however, we can now say we were right. And I think it is important to understand what is happening in the region, despite some of the variables, and really understand what is happening here. Again, going back to three things: the vision of the crisis and the shocks in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are not just cumulative effects from 2008. It's also the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and so forth. And I'd like to be clear that the sum of all of these impacts over the last 8 to 12 years have been structural and economic situations that are new, that cannot be addressed with the same solutions and cannot be analyzed with the same variables. Because when you think that inflation that we had in the 1970s is such and such, no, we can't compare and contrast. These are apples and oranges. We really need to understand that these are new events, things that force us to rethink our economic approach. The second aspect is that we can't look at what's happening here without looking at other aspects. There are things that are explained by the sum of these shocks plus the structural conditions. And that's why in this most recent report, we looked at investment. And that is not happenstance, because what we were concerned with, as Daniel rightly said, next year will not be a good year. The rest of this year will not be a good year. And in fact, unless we see an uptick in investment, we won't be generating new jobs. We won't improve informality or improve our poverty rate or the distribution of income. So therefore, again, it is not a question of happenstance that we've included the question of investment. It's not just a question of income redistribution. we have to generate employment, and that's why we focus so heavily on investment this time around. The primary difficulty there, of course, is inflation. Inflation affects investment. It affects and creates greater poverty, but not just poverty, but also inequality. Those who have a fixed amount of capital, those who have a fixed income, obviously inflation hits them the hardest and therefore creates greater poverty. In that context, and in this context, it's obvious that interventions in monetary policy does help to offset the devaluation of our currencies when the pressure toward that is so high. But we also need to be sure that we don't engage in economic overkill. We have to maintain fiscal policies that keep expenditures in check as well, or at least better targeted, because a lot of the so-called traditional solutions were right in the past, and we need to continue to use such techniques as monetary rates, but it's not sufficient. We need to do new things. What is ECLAC looking at? ECLAC is looking at the structure in the region and what's happening globally. And we're not necessarily understanding this process properly. Second, unless we look at the structural conditions that are needed to bolster investment, all we're going to engage in is providing so called palliative care. It won't help us to maintain a stable and long term environment. And third, we need to understand that monetary policy alone will not solve the problem. And as we're looking at what's happening toward next year in Europe and in the US, and obviously we hope that the Fed will continue to act aggressively with regard to the interest rate. That is our hope, but it's a hope that we've had since the mid 1960s, and we don't really know whether that will work at all. But this is the vision, particularly here at ECLAC. Thank you very much. We will now turn to the Q&A session for a press conference with our colleagues and friends. I'd like to know first whether any of the journalists present in the room would like to ask a question. If you would, please go ahead and indicate where you're from. I am Fernanda Hernandez. I am from Expansión Magazine of Mexico. I'd like to know what the feminine or female labor market is looking like in this post-pandemic era and what the perspectives are for coming months. I think we have to be straightforward in responding. The situation that we've just described, we're seeing a strong slowdown toward the end of this year and into next year, and the impact on the labor market will be significant and even more significant among women for two reasons. First, because the slowdown means a reduction in investment and in work. And obviously, inflation is not neutral. It hits the weakest the hardest, and those who have the lowest negotiating power and those within the family more than anyone else. And that means it affects women more than anyone else. And obviously, inflation generates inequality and it creates, and it's, as I've noted, the weakest the hardest. Therefore, we need to ensure that our economic policies are proactive in that regard. Thank you. Could you please press that button one more time? Great, thank you. Very well. We have some questions that we've seen arriving virtually, those who are following us remotely. I would like to pose 3 questions at a time. And let me start with Cecilia Barria's question, the BBC. And she says, in addition to the rising interest rates, what other actions can countries take to control inflation? The second question from Xinhua is that there are social demands in the region and a need for a new sustainable development model. What role can international cooperation play in that? And let me add to these 2 questions the question posed by Reuters, who's asked us to explain in greater depth why there's been this upturn in January of 2.1 in the region, in April 1.8 in terms of consumption, is as compared to the reduction in 2021. Is that due just to the pandemic, but also what are the perspectives there in terms of fiscal and monetary policies? So let me give you the floor, Mario. Thank you for the question. Let me start with a question by the BBC from Cecilia Barria. I think right at the end of the presentation, ECLAC makes it clear that in addition to the monetary policy, there are a set of other policies that are important and are crucial in terms of macroprudential policies targeting transactions in foreign currencies, the handling of reserves. I mean, there's a set of actions that can be taken in terms of monetary policy, but what we'd like to think about as well is not just a question of reducing inflation, but understanding the root causes of it. And so that we can understand that many of these in the region are imported. I mean, obviously, there's also a certain level of demand that is being created domestically, but there's also a strong imported aspect here in terms of the rising prices of natural gas, gasoline, and so forth. So when you want to reduce imported inflation just by adjusting monetary policy or monetary rate, it's sort of trying to shoot a small animal with a cannonball. It's not the only way. Or in fact, we're not going to get what the results we're trying to get, or avoiding a recession, for example. So we need to look very closely at the root causes. If we see an imported component, then we need to ensure that we're not using just our monetary rate, but also to look at the exchange rate, again, a set of different factors, and provide different instruments looking at transactions, capital transactions, reserves, and financing of capital, and so forth, that can be very important in that area. But we have to keep in mind that when you increase the interest rate so much, then it's or end up being ineffective. We do need to make distinctions by sector. For example, an uptick in the interest rate for agriculture will have a direct impact on our food crisis. Fertilizers is another aspect that obviously has an impact on rising food prices. So not all policies should be the same across the board. They need to be policies that are highly targeted. As to the topic of cooperation, I think this is extremely important. If we look at a recent history of what has happened with vaccines, we have to acknowledge that cooperation wasn't really true cooperation. I mean, we had huge gaps even in the region. We've seen that cooperation very often is something we say, we pay lip service to it, but very often it's not more than window dressing. And so, in this context, obviously, we do need a policy for funding development. We've said this hundreds of times, thousands of times, and nonetheless, the cooperation continues to be very weak. The monetary policy in the strongest, best performing countries is, and providing financing for the least performing countries is extremely important. We need to understand that cooperation has to be focused on increasing development. We think this is particularly important. Topics including medicine, medication, the agriculture and food crisis are important, but we're not seeing much change in that. And we also know that we have many middle income countries in the region. And so we're not getting a lot of direct cooperation. So how do you cooperate with these middle income countries? How do you make the transition and how do you bring to fruition this type of cooperation? Because cooperation is also a topic that we need, but on our end, but we also know it can hurt and be painful on the other, and therefore we need economic coordination on that.
Natalia Ramos from Reuters. I will ask Daniel to answer about the growth rate after this. There was an adjustment, and I'm going to ask Daniel. This has a lot to do with statistics and the weighing of certain economies in the region. So, how's this looking for next year? Well, actually, the only thing that's happened is that whatever should have been done years ago hasn't been done, so we can't really criticize the region. But this time we kind of agree. There's a weak structural condition and broad asymmetries. What do we expect for next year? That these continue to accumulate, all these shocks. So this variation, the central economies are causing a strong impact on the peripheral economies. This is evident and it will continue to be so. But this doesn't really have much to do with the pandemic. It has to do with the 2009 crisis, where a lot was seen in this sense. If we're going to see an increase of the monetary policy, and if these conflicts, the inflation will continue, then we're going to have a shock, a significant shock. And if it's true that in Europe and with the advent of winter, gas price will increase, it's going to affect Europe and it's going to affect all of us. So we expect to see, and we're quite afraid that in the context that is coming, we will see a low price with high inflation and that a single space will be used for macro policies. So we're concerned because with a low investment, the general situation of employment, distribution of equality is a challenge. And on Daniel, he can supplement the information. To supplement what Mario was saying, we have a projection of 1.8, and the change between the projection of this forecast of 1.8 and now has to do with this message. We wish to say that what has happened, if you look at the table, is that most countries are stagnated at a similar growth trend. And especially in the first quarter and the second quarter this year, consumption was lower perhaps than what we expected. Investment was dropping, but a little less speedily than we thought. So some countries are adjusting. And for that reason, in the first and second quarters, they are saying that the monetary policies have taken longer. Monetary policies can take 6 months even to impact the policies. And so what we're seeing between one projection and another is that most countries are maintaining or dropping their or reducing their growth. And we also see that there was a more active first semester, a little more active than expected, and that affects the regional average. And that's why we had that 2.7 projection. But the message doesn't change. The message is that the region is moving, is continuing with the growth path that it had before the pandemic, and we have a more complex situation than we did before the pandemic. There are greater restrictions, a strong drop of investments. So, in a macro and structural um, situation that is more difficult than before the pandemic. So, we will continue to see slow growth in the region. So, we have to rethink the mix of tools for macroeconomic policies in order to face this new structural situation that is more complex. Thank you, Daniel. Second round of questions associated to some of the by the colleagues from the Mexican um, journalists. They follow all these follow these launches closely. So in this block, we will be hearing from Yolanda Morales, an economist. She's asking, how long do you think Mexico will take to recover the GDP growth they had before the pandemic? How does this affect Mexico? And Yvette Saldaña from El Universal is asking, how much has the purchasing power dropped, and in what country do we see the highest drop? And what do you expect to see by the end of 2022? Yvette Saldaña. These are questions that we have received from Mexico. We also have Dora Villanueva from La Jornada, who asks the following: how many people in extreme poverty has the COVID pandemic left us with in Latin America and the Caribbean? How much has this affected acquisition or buying power in Latin America and the Caribbean? And in view of the economic perspectives presented here, what about subsidies and price control of some products in Mexico has a significant effect to protect the population in view of a higher cost of living in Mexico. And this is Yolanda Luz Saldaños from Universal and Dora from La Jornada. You have the floor, Executive Secretary. Danny, maybe you can take this? Well, as we showed you in on one of the slides, there's 16 countries that have not yet recovered their pre-pandemic GDP level. And one could say that Mexico should be reaching a real level of around 18 by 2024. That's it with the growth rates that we see. And has to do with the trajectory that many countries in the region have had. How does this affect? How does inflation affect Mexican families? Well, as we've seen, the inflation as has an impact both in Mexico and around the world. People with lower resources have less tools and less possibilities because they live off a salary. They have less, uh, fewer possibilities of using these instruments. So the negative impacts of distribution hit them harder. They tend to be greater than in the developed countries, both in fiscal policy, social policies of these countries to compensate the effect, and households also have less tools to cope with this. And Latin American countries with low income will be strongly affected as well, especially affected by an inflation that is seeing shocks in food and fuel, which are fundamental for low income households. So the dynamic of inflation has a direct impact on the purchasing power
en los hogares de menores ingresos y eso
in low income
afecta
households, and
a
that
en México en junio
affects
este
them
mes alcanzó una inflación de
more.
8,15
Mexico
la base
reached an
mensual anual.
8.15,
Lamentablemente esta
which is the
inflación
highest in
proviene de
years, and
trabajos extraídos en
unfortunately, this
44 años los gobiernos de
benefit
todos los países del planeta
this is what
para
we've seen in
mantenerlo.
most countries
Esto
on
es un
the
tema.
planet, so it is
Y
an
por
issue.
supuesto,
And
como les decía,
of
los
course,
alimentos y
as we
energía son
mentioned
los que van a
earlier,
afectar fuertemente la capacidad adquisitiva de
it's
las
going to
familias
strongly
de
affect
ciertos
the
más
participative power.
menores. Un tema que sí nos parece importante
Something
destacar
that we
en
believe
un
is
contexto de bajo
important to
crecimiento,
mention is that in a
de una
context of
lentitud,
low growth
de una lentitud en la creación de
and
empleo,
of
el impacto negativo de
very
inflaciones
slow
crecientes
growth
en el
of
sector. Por eso es
employment,
importante combatir la inflación.
it's important to
No
fight
es importante
inflation,
combatir solo la inflación, sino
but
también
not just
establecer
inflation,
empleo
but
y crear
also
crecimiento
it's also
para
important to
combatir la
create
inflación. Los efectos que
employment to
estamos
help
viendo, y ahí viene el desafío de
dampen
establecer
this
la
effect that we're
coordinación y
seeing
coordinación de políticas macro que estamos
and to
planteando.
better
Gracias.
coordinate macro policies, as we mentioned.
Gracias,
Thank you.
Daniel. Yo retomo un poquito lo que
Thank you,
decía
Daniel.
Daniel,
I'm going to
teniendo
pick
también
up
en
on what
consideración
Daniel
el año
said and
pasado.
thinking about last year's
Ivette
balance.
Saldaña, periodista del
Yvette
Universal, Ecuador,
Saldaña
mayor
from
poder adquisitivo
Universal
de América
El
Latina,
Universal asks about
ha
the
golpeado
uh,
fundamentalmente a los sectores, como bien
acquisition or
comentó
buying
Daniel,
power of
de
Latin America.
de los
Daniel,
pobres.
then he
Y uno
said it
piensa que
has
la inflación
affected
acumula en
the poor
alimentos, en
families more. If you
energía,
think
en la
about
canasta
the
de todo, estamos hablando de un pico
inflation
por
that we
arriba
have
del
accrued in food
29%
and fuel, it's
entre
around
diciembre 19
29%
y el
between
20.
December
En educación y
2019 and
energía un
2020. In the case
35
of
y
energy,
esperando un
it's
aumento el próximo
35,
año. Ustedes
but
se
we're
dan cuenta
expecting an
de que
increase next
del
year. So
ingreso de las
the
familias más pobres, gran parte de
lower
su ingreso
income
se
households
dedica a
income is
energía, se dedica
greatly
a
most
gasolinas
of it, for the
y
most part, it
bienes
goes
en
to
alimentos que son
food
los que más
and
noviembre
fuel.
aumentan y por lo
And
tanto
these
eso
are the
golpea mucho
goods
más a
whose
los sectores más humildes. Por lo
prices
tanto, como bien
increase.
decimos nosotros, la inflación es un
So,
tema
as
que
we say,
combatirla y
inflation
combatirla fuertemente,
needs
pero
to be
entender también de
fought,
dónde
but
viene y qué instrumentos
we also
disponemos
need
de
to
nuestros países.
understand
Yo
where it
tengo
comes
la
from.
estimación ceteris
So we
paribus, solo
have
con
the
inflación,
city's was
que la pobreza
only with
representa
inflation, we see that
33%,
it would reach
0,9 puntos porcentuales más alta
33.9%
que el 21, y
actual
la pobreza
points
extrema
higher than
17,7
2021, and
y el
poverty, extreme
5,9
poverty,
que
also
sería los efectos de la sociedad. Pero
14.5%.
atención, estos datos
But
que hacemos nosotros son
this
solo tomando el
information
tema
that
de
we
inflación. Quiere decir que
generate
si el
is
Estado
only based
trabaja
on
para aumentar
inflation. So
déficit, puede ser
if
más
there
alto como
is
estamos
little
previendo
growth
sin
or
tener los números. Por lo tanto,
work
el tema
does
de la
not
inflación es un
increase,
tema
it doesn't really move that
que nos preocupa muchísimo,
needle. So we're
pero
very much concerned with
definitivamente que esto hay que
inflation,
analizarlo y
but of
más
course
allá
it
de
needs
una
to be
determinada
associated
estimación,
with
crecimiento, inversión,
data on
de
growth and
producción,
investment
la
and
inflación va a ser solo
work and then the
temas de
generation of
ajuste fiscal y
employment.
de efecto sobre la sociedad, el impacto distributivo y pobreza,
Otherwise,
etcétera.
it
Y
won't
aquí
have an
viene
impact on distributive effect and
el poder
poverty.
adquisitivo, ya lo hemos repuesto, y aquí viene el tema sobre
And
los
this brings us
subsidios.
to the topic of subsidies to
Evidentemente,
gasoline.
si uno tiene que seguir una línea
Obviously, if you
económica,
have to continue with the green transition,
alza la mano.
and obviously there are questions of gas. I mean, that affects everyone.
Pero si uno va a ver la realidad que
But if
tenemos actualmente
you
en economía,
look
donde
at the
tenemos
reality of our
un
economies,
40 o 50% de informalidad, ¿qué
then
quiere decir informalidad? De
I mean,
gente
what
que
is
ingresa día a
informality?
día,
We
que
have
tiene un ingreso de que tiene que
questions
ir al
of
mercado, tiene que
income day
trabajar,
by day. If you
tiene que
have to
pagar
go
una
out, you have
renta,
to go
tiene
to
un
the
salario, tiene
market.
que moverse y el salario es monetario día a día, que se moviliza todos los días con el
If
transporte
we
público.
mobilize,
Uno se moviliza con los autos, que va a
we can
gasolina, que va
see
por
that
los
there's gasoline
y
and
eso
transportation. In other words,
afecta
gas is
fuertemente
an
si
aspect
tenemos
that has a
en el país
tremendous impact
informalidad o trabajo
on
precario. Y por lo
the
tanto,
precarious
no
labor market, on the
no
informal
considerando
labor
la capacidad
market.
de electricidad de
So
ningún modo, estamos
if you
golpeando la
don't
parte más vulnerable.
consider the
Obviamente esto
ability
no
or the
es verdad
capacity
que nadie
to
esté contento con la
subsidize them,
inflación,
now
y sí,
it has a
y sí,
tremendous
y sí,
impact
queremos que
on
sí,
the
no, pero conociendo las
most
situaciones
humble
estructurales
members
que
of
hay
our
en la Argentina,
society.
ese es un tema muy
Now,
importante
this
para
sounds like
comprender.
something that
Y
is
es evidente
completely
también que si
contrary
uno
to the energy transition and to a
económicamente,
green
lo que
transition.
incide a la
But it's
gasolina es porque
also
está
true
constantemente
that we have
recargada
structural
y
situations in
que
Latin America
sabemos
that
y que
make this of the utmost
seguramente necesitamos
importance. And we
subsidios que permitan
understand,
generar trabajo
therefore,
y sacarlo. Pero
that
ustedes
this
imagínense en
is
la coyuntura como la que se vive
a
hoy en la región,
the price of
con
gas has a
impactos de
very
precios de
strong
energía, de
regressive
alimentos
component.
y una
And
situación
in the
de
mid to
bajo
long
crecimiento,
term,
porque
obviously we would like to see such subsidies lifted, but on a day-to-day basis, given the current set of circumstances, given the lack of a strong welfare system and social network, we have to provide this. It's a monstrosity not to. Morally, ethically, we have to help the grassroots levels, the most impoverished members of our societies. We have to look at this very carefully. It's not just a question of what's happening at the center, but also at the periphery.
No, tengo la impresión de que nos falta abordar las inquietudes de Dora Villanueva de la jornada. Número 8.
There seem to be some pending questions. Daniel?
Respecto a la consulta de Dora Villanueva anteriorista a la
With regard to Dora Villanueva, the journalist from Mexico, in terms of poverty extreme poverty as a result of coronavirus and inflation and food in Latin America and in Mexico, how hard the purchasing power in the region has been hit by inflation and the economic perspective with regard to gas prices. Mario had already answered that, I think. So let me look at Dora's question, a forecast by ECLAC looking at June of this year. We saw that where there was an uptick of around 33 to 33%, 9 percentage points higher than 2021. And there is a uptick, therefore, in the region that we expect will continue to grow as poverty rises, as inflation grows, as Mario has just clearly explained. And this obviously has an impact on employment. And the scenario that we've seen this dynamic from the interpreter. The interpreters do apologize, but the microphone is not in front of the speaker's mouth. The sound is very much wanting. We'll do our best, but we cannot provide accurate statistics under these audio conditions and the quality that we are receiving. In terms of the poverty levels and extreme poverty, as Mario has explained, monetary policy does need to respond to individual circumstances, such as gas subsidies, but we must understand that these are transitory policies and that the region needs to seek to move forward in its energy matrix, and that fiscal policies and these types of responses should not pose an impediment or an incorrect incentive to investment and greater change. Thank you very much, Daniel. Let's go to the next set of questions.
Se han ido generando en el curso de esta entrevista. Sin embargo, hay algunas especificidades en este bloque de preguntas. Orlando Milesi, de Enterprise Service, IPS, en C Noticias, señala.
Let me now turn to the question by Orlando Milesi from Enterprise Service, who says that according to ECLAC, the growth rate in the region will drop, and the question then is the social crisis, how much, what sort of an impact would a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine affect or reactivate or normalize trade? Carlos Rodriguez from Bloomberg Online is asking for information specifically with regard to Colombia, the factors that encourage growth, and whether the government reforms planned will have an impact for 2023. And Patricia Layton from La Nación of San Jose, Costa Rica, is asking whether central banks should continue with a restrictive monetary policy or with regard to raw materials, commodities, or whether this is not necessary, and what will the future performance be of those commodity. Again, those are the three questions from Orlando Milesi, Carlos Rodriguez, and Patricia Leighton. Executive Secretary. Orlando Milesi from Enterprise Service. This process of inflation can generate tremendous social crisis, and obviously the instability in social sectors of informal employment can create rising prices. And that's why we believe that in addition to preventing social crisis, the important aspect is to ensure that there's not more backsliding into extreme poverty, and the unequal distributive process is not something that should continue. Now, what tools can countries use? Well, obviously, active fiscal policy, targeting perhaps certain sectors, more productive sectors, but also fine tuning their policies, policies that look much more specifically at these conditions rather than working, look at addressing these things again indiscriminately. The other topic of concern, of course, is the recovery of investment. This is particularly salient in the region. If there is no investment, we'll see no employment, public or private. The question of investment, sustainability, of inclusion is also of the utmost importance. What the crisis is showing us is that the current paradigm of economic policy has to target production, inclusion, sustainability. And so, therefore, investment policy has to be thought through carefully. How much a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia would help? Certainly, it would help, but there are a lot of countries that have made industrial policy changes, technological productive changes, and so forth, things like microchips, semiconductors, and so forth, that we're seeing, even if the war ends, there's been a fundamental change in these industrial policies and the technology and technology policies. And this is sovereign and sort of internal to each region or each bloc. So certainly the end of the war would help tremendously, but we also have to see what other things have changed forever as a result of it. And failing to understand that means that we're not going to have appropriate development policies at the regional level.
Respecto a la pregunta de Carlos Rodríguez de Bloomberg sobre la dinámica de
Carlos Rodriguez Bloomberg, from Bloomberg's question was about growth in Colombia. With regard to that, Colombian economy grew 12.6% this year in the second quarter as compared to a similar period last year. This confirms that the Colombian economy has seen fast-paced growth, and that it wrapped up last year with an increment of 10.8%, one of the strongest in the region. Therefore, the Colombian economy is recovering faster from the pandemic and has maintained vigorous growth. We can also see a distinction in terms of expenditures, second quarter of last year versus this year. We can also see that consumption in households has also grown by about 12.5%, and gross fixed capital about 23.6%, which is excellent news. And the external demand is also favorable for Colombia because they are a net exporter of hydrocarbons, and their exports have grown 31.8%, imports 32%. And so, for what we've seen in the first semester, we've seen greater dynamics and greater resilience in the Colombian economy, particularly with regard to consumption. So it's more positive there. than the global economy. Also, the normalization of economic activities, the support for government support programs have been maintained, and we've seen an increase also that's been sustained in the availability and access to credit as a result of government policy, as well as favorable rates of exchange. If we look at the dynamics for the coming year, I basically we're looking to see what might happen with potential reforms in obviously the incoming Colombian administration is looking at structural changes and that we believe are going in the right direction. They are also seeking to consolidate the peace process, which for Colombia is a core topic to close the growing gap in productive transformation. Again, of the utmost importance to ensuring better growth and doing so in an environmentally sustainable fashion, in particular looking at sustainable agriculture, industry, and health services. We believe that this has the potential in the mid-term for strong growth. We'll have to see the dynamics of the specific macroeconomic conditions and the global economy, but it does seem that the government's agenda is a step in the right direction and leads us to be optimistic about future economic growth in Colombia, as well as their macroeconomic policy. And obviously, the first step after taking power, the new administration has sought to ensure a tax reform that is approximate to, or equivalent rather to 1.78 percentage points of GDP, seeking a more progressive and equitable distribution of income. Again, that seems to be a step in the right direction and it favors growth because it will allow for the expansion of a fiscal policy that was very much necessary in the past, but also looking at the changes to structure that are very much needed. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to go back on what Daniel mentioned about Colombia. I think that the idea of the reform and structural reform of investments is of the utmost importance. Of course, they're not going to be things that you can do from one day to the other, but of course, the foundation of it should be put in writing somewhere or in a document. Patricia Leighton, believe, are you taking into account the expenses of distribution? Is this necessary? We believe that there are reasons and monetary policies, distributive monetary policies are important for this. And they may be instruments done here and they may be necessary. We have said that there are other policies that accompany these processes. If not, we're simply going to repeat the final effect with an economy with low investment. So that is what we are concerned with. Fiscal policy needs to be maintained and perhaps given these more focused conditions, because these do somehow hit specific areas more specifically. And raw materials, I don't think that next year it will happen as is the case with the European winter. I don't think that energy prices will drop. On the contrary, we believe that they will go up. That's also very important. So we say, sure, there are restrictive policies, but the thing is that with the shocks of raw material, let's bear in mind that they are not over. We need to know how to intervene, though, because if in an inflationary shock period and with a drop in food provisions. If we hit that sector, we're going to have food shortage. So we need to have objective policies for those sectors where part of the population that finds itself in extreme poverty is being hit the most.
Muchísimas gracias a Daniel Titelman y a Mario
Thank you,
Chimoli.
Daniel Titelman,
Muchísimas
Mario
gracias
Cimoli.
a las y
Thank
los
you
colegas
very
que
much
han
to
seguido
all our
esta
colleagues who have
conferencia de
followed
prensa. Hemos
this press
llegado
conference.
al
We
tiempo
have
que
come
habíamos estimado
to the end.
aprobar nuestras
This is
conclusiones
the time that we had
para esta ocasión, pero quiero
estimated
dar
to
cuenta de las inquietudes, no
for our
solamente mías
conference.
y
And
los colegas que nos han
I
hecho
just want to
preguntas
leave you with
que no vamos a alcanzar a abordar en
um,
vivo porque estaríamos
the following
mucho
comment.
tiempo y
There are
probablemente
questions that
tratando de resolver.
we have
Muchas gracias
received
por
that
nombrar
we won't have
comisiones
time
correspondientes
to
porque
answer
hemos
now.
tratado de
I'm going
resolverlas
to
en la
name some
brevedad posible y vamos a
colleagues.
hacerle llegar por escrito
We will
las
send
respuestas
information
eventuales
and the
enviadas.
answers in writing.
Así que quiero reconocer
So
y agradecer a cada
I
uno
would
de ellos.
just
Por
simply
cierto,
like
a
to
Silvia
thank
Rodríguez y el grupo
Silvia
de Mexico
Rodriguez
también
from
por la
Mexico,
invitación de
Adrián Hernandez
expansión
from
hacia
the
México, Raúl Castro
expansion
de
group
Dirija,
in Mexico,
de
Raúl
México,
Castro
Fortune
from
Business de
Dirija,
México, también de Ciudad de
from
México,
Fortune and
Jesús
Business in
Chang,
Mexico City, and Ms.
representante
Chang,
economista de El Salvador,
economist
Daniel
of El
Colín,
Salvador, Daniel
economista de
Colin
PN23 de
from
Guatemala,
PN23,
Ella
Guatemala,
Liche, periodista de economía y política
Erlicher
de
from
Argentina, Yasmín Zaragoza
Argentina,
de El Heraldo de
Yasmin
México,
Zaragoza from El
Evelyn
Heraldo,
Tapia,
Mexico, Evelyn
vicepresidenta de
Tapia
Ecuador, Manuel
from
Moscoso,
Ecuador,
el CEO
Manuel
de Expenditures
Moscosa
México,
from the CEO in
Mauro Álvaro
Mexico,
Montero,
Mauro Álvaro
del Eje
Montero
Central en
from
México,
Eje
y María
Central
Noel
in
Sanguinetti,
Mexico, and Maria
economista
Noel
de Caras
Sanguinetti,
y Caretas
economist
de
of Caras y
Uruguay.
Caretas
También nos han
from
enviado
Uruguay.
sus
They have
inquietudes
also
para
sent
tomar
their
nota
questions,
de
and we
nuestra
will contact you
respuesta
with
elaborada y atento a
more
sus inquietudes por
replies
escrito
during
las
the day.
respuestas
We
a las
hope to do
preguntas
so
que
in
hemos
writing.
hecho. Muchas gracias
Thank
a
you
todas
very
y a
much
todos quienes
to
han
everyone
acompañado este lanzamiento y
who
esta
has joined
conferencia
us
de
in this
prensa.
launch, this press conference, and
Secretario Ejecutivo, algún mensaje final
any
para
other
nuestras
final comments,
personas.
Executive Secretary? First of all, thank you very much. Thank you to our team. It is a pleasure to work with our colleagues and all the divisions that have supported us. The result of this is that when we have questions, all colleagues reply. It is a team. There's people who are dedicated to this all day. So thank you for an excellent job. And also to the press area, thank you to all. I believe that ECLAC's messages are clear. The way in which we understand the region is has a different perspective. It is our perspective. We are very much concerned. We hope to have again a balance for the next 10 years and hopefully for more positive results for the region. So thank you very much. We will reply. We are at your disposal, and um, we would like to invite you to get to know the region in detail, the region, countries, areas. We will continue to work in this direction, and with this team, we will make it possible for sure. Thank you very much. We're at your disposal for any other
Sin
questions you may
pretender
have.
enloquecer, simplemente
Thank you
recordarles que
to
estamos
both of you. I'd like to remind everyone that all the
disponibles
material
para enviar
associated with this
eh,
launch will be
las tablas, por
the
supuesto,
tables, the
se encuentran ya
presentation
disponibles en
are
la página
already
web
available on
de
the
la CEPAL
website
y que
of
queda, por
ECLAC,
supuesto, a nuestra a disposición
www.cepal.org.
pública de la CEPAL para seguir atendiendo
It is all public
inquietudes,
information, and
analizando
we hope to
precios,
continue to
puntos de información
answer
sobre
all your
esta
information
presentación.
needs.
Aprovechar ese disfrute también, queremos agradecer tanto a
We would also like
la
to thank
conferencia que nos ha
the
facilitado
conference unit that
una
has
sala Raúl Previch para
enabled
desarrollar
us
esta idea
to
y a STICSA,
with
además de
the
los
the
equipos de
room, with
inteligencia e
the
información
facility and
que
stick
nos han
for
permitido llegar hasta esta
IT,
hora
and they have
a
also
todo el
enabled the
ancho de la
streaming
región y
service
del
to
mundo.
the entire region
Daniel
and the
Titelman,
world.
jefe de la División
Daniel
Ejecutiva,
Titelman and the
a
Division of
Mario
Economic
Chimoli,
Development,
secretario
Mario
ejecutivo de
Cimoli,
ECLAC,
Executive
muchas gracias
Secretary,
a
Acting Executive
nuestros
Secretary
nuestros
of
colegas.
ECLAC,
Muchísimas
And to all our colleagues, thank you very much. That is all for today.
Muchas gracias.
Goodbye and thank you.